Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here. I am actually in the Daily Mail today with a positive headline about breastfeeding. So if the universe has sort of shifted on its angle today, that is why the Daily Mail is being positive. Because this is one of the big things that I want to talk about today, really. There are two issues that are usually in the press day in, day out when it comes to midwifery: how women have their babies and how they feed them. If you start looking at all the underlying issues, they're exactly the same. The same themes, the same worries, the same backlash against midwives, the same pressure on mothers, the same headlines trying to whip it all up into a debate. And we were talking last night, I was talking with the lovely Sheena about how she would talk about birth and all the different pressures there. And I would say, well, I thought you were talking about breastfeeding for a moment, because the two underlying, it's just the same. So this is some work that came from, well, I'd love to say it came from a deep-seated scientific, research search, but actually it came from an argument on Twitter. I was on Twitter one day and someone was talking about their experience of not being able to breastfeed. And I just made a comment. It's like women are being traumatized by their experiences. They're experiencing trauma. And up popped this psychologist from somewhere and went, oh, you can't use the word trauma when it comes to breastfeeding. And there is nothing more I like being told what I can or cannot do by a middle-aged white man. So I said, oh yes, I can say that, and promptly wrote a research study, went to ethics. A couple of weeks later, put a survey out online asking for women who really wanted to breastfeed but weren't able to do that, and talking about how they felt and how we could help them. I had 3,000 responses in a week. Yes, this was nearly 2 years ago now, because it was qualitative, it was open-ended boxes. I'd asked them about their stories and it just poured out. The emotion, them being let down, just how they felt. And I've spent pretty much the last 2 years reading every single one of those stories. As a researcher, you might say, okay, yes, we'll look at maybe 100 women's stories, but I thought, they've taken the time to tell me, I'm going to listen to this. And this is part of the presentation around what I found. Specifically, trying to work out how we can actually talk about breastfeeding positively without upsetting the women who haven't been able to breastfeed. So how do you talk about breastfeeding without causing harm and hurt to those who have been so badly let down by the system that they haven't been able to? So we know in the UK, in regions around the world, we know the vast majority of women actually want to breastfeed. When you talk to them when they're pregnant, the vast majority in research will say to you, oh yeah, well, yeah, I think I want to give it a go. Well, I'd like to, but I'm not sure if I can. But they want to. And we know that if they then manage to breastfeed, they can go on to have really protected mental health. So it can be really, really good for them. Women who breastfeed have the lowest levels of depression when it goes well. They feel good, they feel empowered. You can start to see the similarities here with birth, can't you? It's exactly the same conversation. But on the other hand, we know that when it goes wrong, it can really go wrong. And as midwives, you will have people come to you who are in their 60s, 70s, 80s and tell you their birth story. As soon as they hear that you're a midwife, they'll tell you about what it was like when they had that baby. And it's exactly the same for breastfeeding. When people hear what I do, they'll start talking about how they couldn't breastfeed their baby, who is now, enjoying their retirement party. It lasts, it's there with them, and it's so important to try and change this. And we have an issue because this is from the Lancet series, nearly 3 years ago now, looking at breastfeeding rates around the world. In the UK, we have the lowest rates in the entire world. Not just, in Europe or something like that, the entire world. Even the USA, where women have to go back to work far sooner, are breastfeeding for longer than us. The issue for me as a psychologist with this graph is that it's not that they wanted to stop. Okay, breastfeeding, yeah, lots of health benefits for mother and baby, great, we should be encouraging it, but actually, to me, it's about what that woman wants to do. And 80–90% of women who stop breastfeeding in the first 6 weeks aren't ready to do so. Now, well, for a small amount of women, there will be a genuine primary physiological reason where they won't have been able to breastfeed. They'll have been taking one of the rare medications that you can't breastfeed on. They might have a physiological issue. But for the vast majority of those women who are stopping, it's because something has gone wrong and they've been let down somewhere along the system. And I could talk about that for hours at a time, but maybe they haven't been able to get the right support because their midwives are rushed off their feet and having to, be everywhere at once and just don't have the time to sit with the mother. Maybe it's society, maybe it's their partner, maybe it's their mother. There are so many things that can make it go wrong. But what we end up with is headlines like this. Parents face too much guilt over breastfeeding. Breastfeeding bullies. Don't bully new mums to breastfeed. Because what we've ended up with is a whole generation of women who desperately wanted to breastfeed, feel let down and feel awful. So they feel so many negative emotions, and the press jump on that. They try to create these bottle breast wars, all these headlines day in, day out, which is why I'm so shocked at the Daily Mail and the positivity this morning. It's the same story as with birth. You see it all the time. You see it at the moment. There are so many headlines going on. And it's taking women's pain and it's turning it into headlines, and it's really, really got to stop. And this was one of the main reasons I wanted to do this research, to work out how we can have this debate, this discussion more effectively. So how do we get away with, how do we stop headlines like this? Because really, those headlines are a load of nonsense. It all comes down to this. Women are grieving because they've been failed over generations by a system that was supposed to support them. And again, you see, am I talking about birth? Am I talking about breastfeeding? It's exactly the same issues that are there. What we need to do is recognise that, to help women heal that, but also talk to future generations of women in a way that can help them. So a way that doesn't end up with all these headlines being published. So the very first question I asked in this research was actually just very simply, how did you feel? And you'd expect, you expect women to say, oh, I felt a bit sad, I was disappointed, maybe I was a bit angry, but the emotions that were coming out were so strong. And again, you can see the parallel with birth. So it's not just sadness, they were heartbroken, they were grieving, they said to me, I feel traumatized, feeling completely out of control with everything because they so desperately wanted to breastfeed. And for whatever reason they wanted to breastfeed for, whether it was for health, whether it was just because they wanted to, whatever that woman's reason, she then wasn't able to. And they were saying things like this, and this is why it's taken 2 years to read the data and read their stories, because it's the strength of the emotion. It's not just, oh, I really wanted to breastfeed and I'm a bit annoyed, I've got to go and buy bottles, but it's, I hate myself. And that strength just came out after mother after mother after mother. We have to do something about these women. Yes, we have to promote breastfeeding, we have to support more women to breastfeed, but we have to promote breastfeeding whilst also protecting women as well, so that it's not just about trying to raise rates, it's about recognising what happens when women can't. So being a bit more positive now, one of the big questions that I asked them was, okay, so you're grieving, you're hurt, you hate it when people mention breastfeeding. What can we actually do? What messages can we use out there in promotion, in supporting women that aren't going to hurt you? Is there anything we can actually do? And sort of reactions were split. So quite a few of them were saying, well, actually, I don't really know. If you find a way, can you get back to me and do it, please, so that I can stop hurting? Another group were saying, well, actually, carry on. We need to support more women. We need to talk about breastfeeding. We can't just stop talking about it. A very minority were angry. Out of those 3,000 women, I had 5 responses that were negative. 5 responses using very choice language, shall we say. One had taken the time to fill out the entire questionnaire to say how much she hated me, and it was my fault. Entirely, the entire breastfeeding situation was my fault. But what came through is that these were women who were hurt, but they still had ideas. They wanted to change, they wanted things to be better. So most of them were coming up with solutions. And what was really interesting about it is a lot of them focused on actually making things better for breastfeeding. But a lot of it was actually around supporting women. So it was not so much that they felt, on the one hand, they felt terrible that they couldn't breastfeed, But what then happened is that they felt so let down after that, and that there was not the service for them, there was not the support for them, that's what they were actually grieving for, that they felt so vulnerable and so upset by it, but then nobody was there. They hadn't got a service. What could be there in its place? So the very first thing they wanted was better support for breastfeeding, which was quite an unusual thing. I thought they were all going to say, oh, no, stop promoting breastfeeding, please. But actually, the vast majority were going, actually, what we need to do first is fix breastfeeding so the next generation of women aren't going to experience the problems that I'm having, so that they won't face this. So it was things not just around supporting breastfeeding, but doing more research into complications. At the moment, when a woman can't breastfeed, often formula gets given as a solution. It's like we spend the whole pregnancy going, breast is best for your baby, breastfeed your baby, please. And then they have this issue, and it's like, oh, can you give a bottle instead? Or you haven't got enough milk. Oh, we'll give that solution. And a lot of women are just told, oh, you don't seem to have enough milk. Oh, you can't breastfeed. And they can never have any kind of diagnosis. We don't have any real understanding of the physiological complications that really affect breastfeeding. Second one was better training for professionals. And when they say better training there, one of the big things was more time rather than more training, more time. But it wasn't, most of them were not talking about midwives. Most of them were talking about GPs. And a lot of midwives have said to me over the years, we seem to have an issue where a breastfeeding woman goes to the GP with a breastfeeding problem and she comes out with formula as a solution. GPs are not specialists in breastfeeding. Well, most of them aren't. But how can we change things there? How can we make things better so that women, whoever they see, whether it's a nursery nurse, whether it's someone in a childcare facility, whether it's a general practitioner, who's going to give the good advice? The third thing here was actually realistic expectations. This is a big one for me. A lot of women were saying that one of the biggest issues that they had is that they were never told that breastfeeding could be tough. It's like we tell women that breastfeeding is the easiest thing in the world. It's lovely, you're going to bond with your baby, it's going to be wonderful. Maybe it can be. It is for a lot of women. But often it's quite challenging in those first weeks, like anything. Often we end up not telling women that it's going to be challenging because we think it's going to put them off. You know, it's a bit of a strange logic. They've just had a baby, yet we're afraid to tell them that it might be a little bit challenging. They go and they run marathons, but we don't want to tell them that it could be a little bit challenging. Anything in life that is worth doing is usually a little bit challenging. And also, you don't have to love it all the time. There's an article going around, I think it's a meme going around Facebook at the moment around breastfeeding and babies in general, about this idea that can we stop having to be positive about everything all the time? Just because I find it challenging doesn't mean I don't want to do it. Just because I'm going to complain about it doesn't mean I don't love it. You complain about your partner all the time. You're not going to get rid of them, probably. You complain about your job all the time, but you usually go back the next day. So how can we prepare women better? And it's not telling them it's going to be awful, but normal baby behaviour. Baby's going to wake up a lot. They're going to want to feed a lot. They're going to cluster feed. How do we do that? How do we set them up so they just feel better prepared? The second one with feeding messages. So how we actually talk about breastfeeding. And this one comes up time and time again. Get rid of this awful breast is best message. But it is everywhere. Even the World Health Organization say breast is best for your baby. A, it's not best because it's normal. Something physiologically normal cannot be best for a baby. But saying it's best sets up so many connotations. So it's best. So if you can't breastfeed, what does that make you? Are you not doing the best for your baby? Are you not the best mother? It can hit women so hard. And just one of the quotes here, why does the government think telling women something is best is in any way helpful? I know it's best, but it misses the point that I am trying my best, but I just haven't been able to. Any psychologist will tell you, saying to someone something's best don't work. You can tell me all the time it's best not to drink lots of red wine the night before you do a presentation to a group of midwives, but that doesn't stop us, does it, Sheena? And wider language. I've still got the awful breast is best message twice now, just to get it there. But even things like, language and midwifery, it's huge. Language and birth is huge. But just things like talking about nipple confusion or artificial feeding, The confused nipple, how does it make a woman feel when part of her body is confused? Or she's using artificial, and a lot of people will say, well, it is artificial milk. And I think, but what does that actually say? That you're artificially feeding your baby robot? I don't know what it is. The language of choice is a big one. The one phrase I would love to get rid of is choose not to breastfeed. In so many circumstances, women are not choosing. They want to breastfeed, they end up formula feeding, but they didn't choose to formula feed. They had to make the decision to. And there's a big difference, because choose sounds like you're in control and you're picking this choice out of all these options for you. But it's not, because you've reached the situation where you have got such difficulty that you can't breastfeed, and you're not choosing that. And again, this woman's great down the bottom. I want to throttle anyone who used the word failed when talking about a mother. Failed to breastfeed. That's a phrase you'll see a lot when people are writing. Breastfeeding failure. No, it's not failure. Well, maybe it's system failure. It's women being let down failure. But that woman did not fail to breastfeed. Message content. We have a tendency to talk about health benefits for the child, health benefits that your baby will get sick, your baby will have all sorts of illnesses. It gets very catastrophic sometimes. But when actually you're talking about breastfeeding, a lot of the time women go, well, actually, of course I breastfeed because it's good for my baby, but actually it's just because I wanted to. It wasn't really about that. It was something I wanted for me. It was instinctual. It had so many other benefits for me. It was more convenient once I got it sorted in those first early weeks. So thinking about kind of more wider focus. Getting rid of the deterministic language. I think we have a big problem with this in public health in general. We say, okay, so there's a finding that shows that babies have double the risk of this. There's one for leukemia where there is a really, really, really low odds of your baby developing leukemia, thankfully. But that if you breastfeed, the risk is half. And that sounds like a really powerful statistic until you realize it's 1 in however many hundreds of thousands chance. Very, very similar with birth. Such parallels with this. It's hard to put on a health promotion poster, but to say that breastfeeding helps protect your baby, it helps reduce the risk of something, is far better than leading women to think that it's so deterministic that their baby is immediately going to explode if you give them formula, because it's not helpful. Recognising the challenge of breastfeeding, so really just recognising, holding space for women who cannot breastfeed, who have not been able to for whatever reason, recognising them, having something there for them. Stop saying breastfeeding is easy. I think I probably covered that one in another one, and it was something I wrote about recently in a conversation article, actually saying, stop portraying breastfeeding as a utopia, then personal expectations may be lower. No one talks about what can go wrong or how long a feed can take. But again, it's not that we're going to put women off. They're not that, weak and going to break because you say to them something's a bit tough. Kimberly Seals-Allers, who's a journalist in the US, fantastic book on breastfeeding, talks about the idea that we're scared to tell women that something might be challenging or that it potentially might be a bit uncomfortable. And then, they're sat there and they've got tattoos and they've got piercings and we're worried. Do we think women are going to break in some way? Don't be so black and white. So, having this kind of middle ground, and I think this is a big one, in that we've somehow got this issue where we have women are either going to formula feed or they're going to breastfeed exclusively for 6 months. And in practice, we know 6 months exclusive breastfeeding is what we're aiming for, but in reality, 1% of women in the UK are getting there at the moment. There is a whole middle ground, and what women often say to me in research, well, I didn't quite have enough milk and I needed to supplement with formula, so I gave up breastfeeding. And I thought, well, what? No, there's a middle ground. Mixed feeding will have a benefit over just formula feeding. Setting a target for a mum who wants to just breastfeed for 2 weeks and her getting there when the rest of her family has never breastfed is huge and something that should be really celebrated. Helping women get to the end of the week when they're struggling and saying, oh, I just can't do it. They've got their baby who's 10 days old and is cluster feeding, and they've got this 6-month deadline kind of looming. You say, well, why don't we just see what you like tomorrow? A few days more, and sometimes, bit by bit, you get them over that hump. Recognising the emotions that not being able to breastfeed can bring. So actually recognising women's experiences, giving them space to actually say how awful they felt. and having something available for them that is going to help them there. And providing emotional support. There is very little service availability out there for women to kind of debrief about breastfeeding. Who do they go and talk to? Do they go and talk to one of the breastfeeding lines? One of the breastfeeding lines, they would be really helpful. They'd welcome women. But is it the right space for them? We need some sort of support for women, just to be able to talk to them, talk them through it, debrief them. This is not your fault. Let's move away from failure. Think about what you did do rather than what you haven't. Look, you've managed to breastfeed for 3 weeks. This is great. This leads me to this. You may see the concept of telling women that fed is best. Over the internet, there are foundations. It splits opinion hugely. Some people will say, saying to women, it does not matter, okay? Fed is best. How does that fit with the birth literature? All that matters is that you've got a healthy baby. Your experience doesn't matter. This is the worry, and some people will be comforted by just saying, oh, don't worry, fed is best, it doesn't matter. You're doing your best. What we need is that baby to be fed. But a lot of women, and I didn't even ask the question, were saying to me, it invalidates my experience. It makes it feel like you're telling me my desire to breastfeed that baby, my breastfeeding relationship with that baby, does not matter. If it doesn't matter, what does that mean? What does that mean for my emotions? And the parallels with all that matters if you've got a healthy baby are really there. More practically, considering how formula feeding mums are supported, what support is actually out there for them? A lot of mums were saying that they felt let down, stretched services, finding that they couldn't access any feeding services. What is actually out there for mums to help them to bottle feed? There's a big difference between promoting bottle feeding and making sure that women who are bottle feeding are doing it safely, because that's one of the big issues. A lot of outdated advice goes around. A lot of women you will find still think that you have to boil the water for a bottle because there is something wrong with the water, rather than the fact that formula powder isn't sterile. So what they'll do is they'll boil water, let it cool down, and then add it to the formula powder. But actually, it's the potential contaminants in the formula powder that you're trying to kill. So that should have boiling water added to it. So it's things like this, but also making sure that everyone's welcome. One woman, I think it's on the next slide, found that, and this shouldn't happen, but it did happen to her, that she was a breastfeeding mum. She went along to a breastfeeding support group. She made great friends. It got her out of the house every week. She hit 5 weeks and wasn't able to breastfeed anymore. And she was told she couldn't come along to the group anymore because she was no longer a breastfeeding mother. Now, she's grieving not being able to breastfeed, but actually for her, it was that segregation, that social isolation, the loss of the friendship, the loss of the structure, the loss of getting out the house. And there was no equivalent group. Because of funding cuts, there was no mum and baby group that she could pop along to in the same way. So again, it's thinking, can we have feeding clinics? You don't want to call it a clinic, a feeding support group in some way where mums can come together. It's a very split issue. Some will say breastfeeding mothers need a safe space, which they do. Some will say that it might encourage mums who are breastfeeding to give a bottle, but actually, what about if it encourages mums who are bottle feeding to breastfeed the next baby because they've been integrated and they see that mix? And again, it will be a case of, we need more funding, we need more investment, and it comes back time and time again to this issue of funding in maternity services, because ideally you'd have your breastfeeding group, you'd have your mum and baby group, you'd have a feeding support group, and mums could all go along to them and they'd have enough. This leads me to this, just generally, and again, I could be talking about birth. Better value for mothers. Invest in mothers more generally. If we actually invested better in maternity services, better in families, better in mothers, if the money was there to really properly support women, you wouldn't end up in this situation in the first place. Because you see the same path. You see a mum who at 8 weeks is grieving, and you track her back and you see the same story. She ended up with a complicated birth that probably needn't have happened. She had that complicated birth. A complicated birth makes breastfeeding more difficult. So now she's grieving the loss of the birth that she wanted. Then she's grieving the loss of the breastfeeding relationship she wanted. And she ends up in this place at 8 weeks where she's traumatized by it all. when actually if the investment was there, the time was there, the amount of midwives was times by 100, should we say, just to be realistic. If the investment was there for them, you'd be looking at a very, very different situation. Another big one, recognise what the mummy wars are. Twitter, Facebook, kind of social media celebrities, newspapers. They're making money by pitting women against each other. The breastfeeding versus formula feeding battles that you see online are nonsensical. So few women formula feed exclusively from birth or breastfeed exclusively. The vast majority of women use both. So where on earth does this battle come from? It's designed to distract. It's designed to pit women against each other rather than them stepping back and going, hang on a minute, we've all got the same issues. We were all let down by a system. But what happens is that they want to pit them against each other to stop them putting pressure on actually improving the system. So, smash the patriarchy, just generally being a... But supporting women on that vein to redirect how they're feeling. You'll see it with birth, you'll see it with breastfeeding. Something happens to the woman and she blames herself, as if she was the only person responsible for that situation. For birth, for breastfeeding, how do we get women to see that they were let down? They were let down by the government not investing properly. They were let down because midwives don't have enough time. They were let down by a society that tells them that they shouldn't be breastfeeding in public. They were let down by not enough education or public understanding out there. But women, we blame ourselves. We think, oh, it must be our fault. And actually helping women to think, all right, okay, so you couldn't breastfeed. Was that just down to you? Or, was your partner supportive? Did they really support you? Were your family supportive or work supportive? Were you in a supportive environment? Were there enough services available for you? Did you manage to get support every time you needed it from a health professional because they had the time to spend with you? So is it really your fault? No, it's not. And you can apply that time and time again. So helping women realise it's not their fault. And just generally creating a more breastfeeding-friendly society, a more mother-friendly society, where mothers can thrive, where babies can thrive. Bringing it all together then, the main point, a lot of the damage, how women are feeling when you see those headlines about women feeling pressurised and too much pressure to breastfeed, a lot of it isn't actually coming just from not being able to meet their breastfeeding goals. It's coming from how they are treated. Whether someone has looked at them and said, you're hurting, aren't you? Should we talk about it? Should we talk you through this? Should we help you? Should we help you see that this isn't your fault? Should we recognise that how you wanted to feed your baby was really important to you? Let's talk about it now so you're not coming back in 50 years and saying, I still feel dreadful for not breastfeeding my baby. So recognising and valuing how women feel, valuing women. Basically, we could take this for the entire how we treat mothers and families. Helping them explore where those feelings come from and helping them move past that. Supporting women to join the dots together, so talking them through that. What was your experience? How do you feel? Ensuring that we protect all women, so all women have, future women have the right, the availability of health promotion messages to talk through breastfeeding to be supported, but also making sure that we support these women. And just generally realising that when you see these headlines and when you see people pop up on social media who are deeply critical of breastfeeding, of birth, of midwives, of the service, who are trying to drum it up, they are not the majority. The majority are wanting to move forward. They're wanting a solution where women are protected.